We were told not to enter the Barrow House, but the singing drew me in. What if you were told never to cross the edge of a village road because the air itself might carry something you were not meant to hear? In a forgotten corner of 18th century Europe, beyond the plowed fields and the tired cottages of a people who lived by silence, there stood the Barrow House. Its walls sagged under moss, its windows were blind with dust, and its chimneys had long stopped breathing smoke. Yet still, children whispered that it was not empty. They whispered that when the nights were heavy and the wind did not move, a sound would come from its cellar, a faint string of notes that had no instrument, no choir, no human mouth to explain them. The sound was always fragile, as though someone trapped far beneath the earth was trying to teach their lungs to sing through soil. The villagers feared the house in a way they never spoke of openly. To name fear gave it shape, and to give shape meant inviting it closer. They only told their children to never follow the music. They said wolves lived in the timbers, that poison leaked from the stones, that stepping inside would wither the bones of the living. But children are drawn to the forbidden more than to safety. When the first brave one pressed an ear against the cold wall of the cellar, he heard not only singing, but breathing, as though someone was teaching themselves to become a different kind of creature inside. He never spoke of what else he felt. His hair turned white before his time, and he carried a quiet inside him that no one could reach. To the adults, the house was older than memory. Some said it had been the residence of a physician who served kings in the last century, a man praised for his calm, his white gloves, his devotion to the poor. Others said it had belonged to monks expelled for forbidden rites. None could agree, and no one wished to look for records. History had holes that were safer left unfilled. It was enough to pass by quickly, eyes lowered, pretending the rotting roof was only another ruin and not a wound in the ground that still breathed. The Barrow House carried a weight that grew heavier at dusk. Travelers passing through the village often asked why doors were bolted so early, why even the tavern fell quiet once the last light slipped. They laughed when told about the cellar songs, yet those who stayed the night often left before dawn, pale and hollow, swearing they had heard the cries of children singing scales that rose too high for any throat. These were not the songs of joy or faith, but of lessons drilled into voices until the voices broke. More than one traveler spoke of hearing sobs woven between notes, as though the music itself was forced labor. What if someone truly believed those whispers? What if someone believed that music had not died with its singers, but continued in the dark long after flesh had gone? The house stood as proof to those thoughts. Animals would not cross its yard. Grass grew taller than men, yet no flower dared open. The well beside it was said to hold water that stank of iron, as though blood had been washed into it for years. And yet, on certain moonless nights, a sweetness drifted from the broken shutters, a faint perfume, like pressed violets rotting in a book. It was said that this smell was carried on the breath of the singer, a fragrance that did not belong to the living or the dead. The villagers had rules for survival. Do not answer when the notes call your name. Do not follow if you hear your mother's lullaby. Do not look inside, even if the window shines with candlelight. They knew the house took shape from desire, twisting what was dearest into bait. Yet every generation, one child would step too close, pulled by what they longed to hear again. Some swore they heard the voice of their lost father or a sibling buried years before. Each time, the village buried another small coffin. Each time, they nailed the shutters tighter, though the songs slipped through it as though it were nothing. No one spoke of what was found when the bodies were returned, if they were returned at all. The silence was its own protection. But the truth lingered in the way neighbors averted their eyes when the grieving family passed, in the way priests stuttered at funerals, in the way the old refused to sit near the house even in daylight. The horror was not only in what the Barrow House did, but in how it made the living complicit. Everyone heard, everyone knew, but no one acted. As years passed, the warnings became tradition. Children repeated them as chants while playing, not fully knowing the weight of the words. The Barrow House became both a threat and a story, an ever-present reminder that some walls held more than stone, that a door could be both wood and mouth. And so the story of the singing lingered, not fading, not growing louder, but steady, like a pulse under the earth waiting for someone foolish enough to follow it down. This is where our story begins, in a village where silence was safety, and where the greatest danger was not the ruin itself but the fragile, irresistible sound that came from within. The Barrow House did not always stand as ruin. Once it had been home to a man whose name slipped away from history but whose shadow remained pressed into the walls. He was called physician, scholar, and gentleman. In the early years of the century, when famine thinned the bodies of the poor and fever burned through whole parishes, he moved into the village dressed not in the rags of traveling doctors but in tailored coats, polished boots, and the clean white gloves that never left his hands. He greeted the hungry with warmth, carried bread to doorsteps, and pressed coins into palms too weak to resist. Mothers whispered thanks to him, fathers trusted his counsel, and children lifted their arms to him when sickness laid them down. He became, in a matter of months, the most respected figure in a village that had learned to bow its head before hunger and plague. But the gloves hid more than cleanliness. He was careful with them, always replacing them before they grew worn, as though the fabric itself carried secrets. Those who observed closely noticed that he never removed them, not for meals, not even at the church altar when the priest pressed bread against his lips. His explanation was simple: the gloves protected him, and therefore protected everyone else. The villagers, weary of questioning kindness in a world that gave them so little of it, accepted the answer. They did not ask what the gloves hid, or what stain he feared would show on bare skin. The physician built his reputation on small mercies. He offered medicines others could not afford, refusing payment with a modest smile. He walked into cottages no other man would enter, soothing the fevers of the dying. His presence seemed holy, as if Providence itself had chosen him to bring relief. Yet there were details that unsettled those who looked longer. He did not pray when the sick slipped away. He did not weep when infants turned cold in their cribs. His comfort was steady, rehearsed, and detached, like a man who had memorized the role of compassion without feeling the weight of it. Inside the Barrow House, the rooms were orderly, almost sterile, a contrast to the mud and smoke of village cottages. Books lined the walls, filled with anatomical drawings too precise for common eyes. Jars of powders, oils, and roots gleamed in rows, labeled in Latin that no one in the village could read. To the casual visitor, it was the home of knowledge. But those who stayed longer described the silence as oppressive. No laughter ever echoed within, no conversation lingered in its halls. The only constant sound was the slow ticking of clocks, more clocks than seemed necessary, each measuring time in a rhythm that was both comforting and unnerving. It was said that he took particular interest in children, not with cruelty but with attentiveness that felt too exact. He spoke to them softly, asking them to sing for him while he measured their pulse. He brought them toys carved from bone or wood, objects polished smooth and cold to the touch. Parents, desperate for any kindness, saw only generosity. They did not see how he watched the children as though studying an experiment, how he leaned closer when their voices cracked on high notes, how his gloved hands sometimes lingered on their throats a second too long under the excuse of checking for swelling. In the daylight, he was a saint. In the twilight, when shutters closed and lamps dimmed, villagers sometimes caught sight of him walking back from the churchyard, his gloved hands clasped as though in prayer. Yet those who saw him said his lips were not moving. Instead, he seemed to listen, head tilted slightly, as though the earth itself whispered back to him. Some swore they heard faint hums escaping him, a single held note, low and steady, as if he was tuning his body to something no one else could hear. His goodness became his armor. When the first poor child went missing, suspicion never turned to him. He led the search, speaking gently to grieving parents, carrying lanterns through the fields. When an old beggar vanished in the frost, it was he who rang the church bell in warning. Each absence was explained away: wolves, winter, the wandering of those with no ties. Each time, the gentleman in gloves was present, calm, reassuring, his reputation strengthened by tragedy. Behind his walls, however, his mind worked with precision. He was not careless, driven by wild impulse. He believed in order. His white gloves were not a disguise of shame but of ritual, a symbol of separation between himself and the chaos of others. To him, the body was only material, the voice only an instrument, and suffering a passage to knowledge. He saw no evil in what he did. In his reasoning, he he was preserving beauty others wasted, saving the last breath, the last cry, the last note of life before it dissolved into nothing. His mask of charity was not hypocrisy, it was necessity. Without the trust of the living, he could not collect the dying. The villagers admired him until admiration became dependency. They relied on his cures, his bread, his guidance. To doubt him would mean doubting the very mercy they clung to. And so he thrived behind the mask of innocence, methodical in his routine, calm in his cruelty, invisible in plain sight. His gloves stayed spotless, even as the cellar beneath his house began to fill with secrets that could no longer be hidden forever. The singing would come later. For now, the village slept under the illusion of safety, held in the soft grip of a man they called Savior. And while they slept, the Barrow House listened. It began so quietly that no one could mark the first moment. In villages where hunger was constant and sickness struck without reason, the vanishing of a single orphan was not considered strange. Children without parents often wandered until they were lost to rivers, forests, or roads. The villagers mourned briefly, but soon returned to the work of survival. It was easier to explain absence as fate than to admit something darker. And so when the first small boy, no more than 6, did not return from gathering firewood, it was whispered that he had gone too deep into the woods and been taken by wolves. Mothers crossed themselves, fathers searched the tree line, and when no body was found, the boy was folded into silence. But wolves do not leave behind neatly tied bundles of wood outside a cellar door. The villagers never knew that the boy had left his bundle there, carefully stacked, as though instructed. They never knew that he had been lured not by hunger but by music, faint, rhythmic, a child's lullaby shaped into something unfamiliar. That night, when the physician was asked to bless the grieving mother, he placed a gloved hand on her shoulder and told her that the Lord sometimes called the purest children first. His calm voice stilled her sobs, even as his mind quietly recorded the sound of her grief. Weeks passed, then months, and the pattern repeated. A beggar who slept in barns, a mute girl who never spoke, an old man with no kin, all vanished with no trace. Each time, the physician stood with the villagers, holding lanterns, calling names into the night. Each time, he comforted the bereaved with scripture, never missing a word, his white gloves shining in the glow of firelight. To those who leaned on him, he was steadfast, a pillar in storm. To himself, he was methodical, testing boundaries, selecting with care, avoiding suspicion by choosing those society did not value enough to fight for. What the villagers did not see was how carefully he prepared his cellar for them. Beneath the Barrow House, where stone walls pressed close and air grew damp, he had carved a room with precision. It was not a dungeon of chaos but a chamber of purpose. The walls were lined with shelves where glass jars stood waiting. The table in the center was smooth, polished, always washed clean, as though blood itself had been taught discipline. He kept instruments arranged in perfect rows, each with a place, each sharpened or polished daily. The cellar was not built for murder, it was built for study, for ritual, for performances only he understood. He believed the body revealed its secrets only at the edge of life. He listened when his victims breathed, when they tried to scream, when their hearts raced in panic. He saw not terror but data, not suffering but revelation. He did not think of himself as cruel. Cruelty was wasteful, loud, unplanned. His acts were measured, timed, recorded in notebooks where the ink never smudged. To him, the cellar was a laboratory, and those who entered were participants in a process greater than themselves. They were, in his mind, instruments tuned by fear, voices sharpened by pain into notes no living choir could ever reproduce. The disappearances grew harder to dismiss as coincidence. Families noticed the pattern, though they dared not speak it aloud. It was always the voiceless, the forgotten, the solitary. Children with no parents, wanderers with no friends, elders too weak to resist. It was as if someone chose the ones least likely to be defended. Still, suspicion never turned toward the physician. He was always there with his lantern, always there with his words of comfort. The village trusted him more with each loss, for who else cared enough to search when all others had given up? And yet, a shadow fell across the village. Nights felt longer. The air around the Barrow House seemed colder, even when fires burned bright. Travelers began to speak of strange sounds near the ruin, not only music, but weeping, drawn out and unnatural, as though the house itself was teaching sorrow how to last beyond death. They said the earth near the cellar door carried a vibration, a faint hum that could be felt through the soles of boots. Some swore the vibrations matched the beat of a heart. The villagers avoided the subject, but silence did not stop fear from spreading. Mothers began keeping children closer, fathers carried knives into the fields. No one accused, for no one could name what haunted them. But beneath the mask of normalcy, the physician grew bolder. He understood now that fear protected him more than denial. The villagers were too afraid to investigate, too dependent on his kindness to risk losing him. He could continue his work without question. The cellar filled slowly, methodically, not with chaos but with order. Jars lined with fluids, fragments of bone arranged like specimens, notes scribbled with precision. The physician believed he was capturing something eternal, something beyond flesh. The villagers prayed for safety, blind to the truth that the danger wore white gloves and walked among them daily. The first disappearances were not accidents of fate. They were trials, rehearsals, the earliest steps in a ritual that would soon darken every corner of the village. The Barrow House had awakened, and the songs that drifted from its cellar were only the beginning. The cellar of the Barrow House was not built for blood alone. It was built for sound. The physician, hidden behind his white gloves and soft smile, believed that the human voice was the most fragile proof of life. He believed every cry, every scream, every final breath carried something eternal, a resonance that revealed the truth of the soul. But he also believed that no one had ever preserved that truth properly. Flesh rotted, bones crumbled, but sound slipped away into the air like smoke. His obsession became simple in his mind, to capture the last notes of the dying, to bind them, to hold them beyond death. He began with small trials. Victims were restrained not with chains but with delicate iron frames that held the chest in place and forced the throat upright. He placed wires across their vocal cords, threaded carefully through incisions, then stretched tight with screws. Each adjustment changed the pitch of their screams, like strings of an instrument. He recorded the variations in meticulous notebooks, noting how fear altered the sound, how pain sharpened it, how hopelessness deepened it. He was not interested in their words, only in the raw resonance of human suffering. When their lungs failed, he devised ways to keep them singing. Tubes filled with bellows pumped air into collapsing chests, forcing voices to hold impossible notes until the cords frayed. He listened with fascination as the voice broke, splitting into shrieks that echoed off stone. These sounds were not accidents to him. They were data, proof that the body could be made to produce tones beyond ordinary limits if guided by science and will. He wrote of this as progress, never cruelty, believing himself chosen to uncover truths others feared to seek. But listening was not enough. He wanted to preserve. He filled jars with brine, each marked with the victim's name, though most names were guessed. He believed that the water held the memory of the vibration. After every session, he lowered a funnel over the mouth of the dying and captured their final scream into the liquid, sealing the jar at once. He swore he could hear it later if he pressed his ear close, faint at first, then clearer with time. The jars became his choir, resting on shelves, each containing what he called the essence of the note. To outsiders they would have looked empty, but to him they sang endlessly. His methods grew more elaborate. Some victims were strapped into iron masks with tubes leading from their throats into horns of brass. Their screams blasted through the horns, shaking the cellar walls, and the physician stood in awe as the sound filled his chamber like thunder. He sketched designs for larger instruments made of bone and skin, believing that he could build an organ powered not by air but by life itself. He dreamed of a single performance that would outlast history, an opera of pain and resonance that no cathedral could silence. Yet even in his obsession, he remained careful. Each disappearance was chosen with logic. The mute, the forgotten, the unwanted, they became notes in his collection, instruments for his experiment. He avoided the strong, avoided those whose loss would stir outrage. To the village he remained a savior, treating fevers by day, smiling gently at mothers, while by night he conducted his hidden symphonies in stone. The contradiction was complete. His goodness was the mask. His cellar was the truth. The victim's suffering was not only physical but ritualistic. He forced them to hum lullabies as he adjusted the wires, demanding that they hold melodies even as their throats bled. He believed the contrast of innocence and agony produced a purer tone. When voices broke, he did not silence them, he recorded the crack, describing it as the voice tearing open a gate to eternity. He convinced himself that each scream was a kind of offering, a key to unlocking the music of the human spirit. The jars multiplied. Hundreds lined the walls, rows of sealed glass filled with clear liquid that to him shimmered faintly in the lantern light. He would walk among them at night, gloved hand trailing across the shelves, listening. Sometimes he swore the jars whispered back. He called them by the names of saints, as if the victims had been transformed into holy relics. The cellar became less a laboratory and more a chapel, a shrine to sounds that should never have existed. The villagers did not know the truth, but they felt its weight. They complained of strange echoes near the Barrow House, sounds that seemed too high for any bird, too long for any wind. Travelers said the air itself trembled when they passed. Children swore they heard their own names sung faintly at night. Fear grew, but no one spoke against the physician. He was the hand that fed them, the healer who tended their wounds. To accuse him would be to accuse their only hope of mercy. And so they turned their fear inward, convincing themselves the sounds were tricks of wind, nothing more. The physician's obsession deepened into certainty. He believed he was building a new form of immortality. The dead were silent, but through him they still sang. He did not see victims, he saw voices freed from flesh, bound in glass, eternal. His cruelty was not madness in his mind, but a gift to history, a discovery that would one day be recognized as divine. And so the cellar of the Barrow House became the archive of screams, a library no one wished to open, a place where voices were stolen and stored like treasures. Each jar, each wire, each torn throat was another step toward the grand performance he imagined. The village remained blind, trusting the man in white gloves. But the walls of the cellar were no longer silent. They pulsed with the resonance of the collection, humming faintly, as if waiting for the day the jars would be opened all at once and the house itself would sing. The cellar of the Barrow House did not remain a laboratory. Over time, it transformed into something even more grotesque, a theater. The physician, no longer satisfied with jars of screams and fractured notes, began to envision each death as part of a greater composition. To him, suffering was not only sound, it was performance. He wanted not just to capture cries, but to arrange them, to script them, to mold human agony into a play that only he could direct. He began with mannequins. In the upstairs rooms, villagers sometimes glimpsed crates being carried inside, though none dared ask what lay within. The mannequins were life-sized, painted with care, dressed in fine clothes scavenged from coffins or markets. He sat them in chairs around the cellar, arranging them in rows as though forming an audience. He angled their heads toward the center table, positioned their hands in gestures of applause, even dusted them to keep them from appearing abandoned. When lantern light flickered across them, their glass eyes gleamed as though watching. The physician would bow to them before each ritual, convinced he was not alone, convinced his performances were witnessed. The victims became actors in roles they never chose. He tied them upright, their bodies stiffened into postures of nobility or devotion. He dressed them in tattered robes or painted masks, then forced them to sing as he adjusted wires across their throats. He gave them scripts carved into wood, though most could not read them. It did not matter. He told them their task was to deliver emotion, and he made sure they obeyed by turning pain into punctuation. When their voices cracked, he declared it a climax. When they sobbed, he called it tragedy. Each collapse, each scream, became a line in his invisible script. But silence was his final act. He did not want endless shrieking, he wanted endings that carried weight, pauses that echoed louder than sound. He devised a ritual he called the fall of curtains. He would let the victims sing until their throat tore, then force them into stillness with sudden strangulation, as though cutting off a play at its height. The silence that followed was, in his mind, the most important note. He believed silence could be sculpted, that it could hold meaning if placed carefully between cries. And so he timed the pauses, recorded the length of each death, arranging his notes like a composer laying out rests in a score. The mannequins were not enough. He longed for applause, for a response that would confirm the value of his art. And so he built crude devices from bones and reeds, fastening them into the mannequins' chests. When air was pushed through, the mannequins wheezed or moaned in hollow tones. After each death, he pumped their bellows, filling the cellar with grotesque imitation applause, a chorus of wheezes echoing his satisfaction. He clapped along, bowing deeply, thanking his audience for attending. To him, these plays were holy. He called them mysteries, not murders. He wrote notes in his journals describing himself as priest and director both, guiding souls through their final performance before eternity. He saw cruelty as ritual, death as drama, and himself as the only one capable of interpreting the script. His performances were private, but he imagined them being replayed forever in the jars of sound he preserved, an eternal theater sealed in glass. Outside, the village grew restless. Strange lights were reported glowing from the windows of the Barrow House at night, soft at first, then bright enough to cast shadows across the yard. Some claimed they heard applause drifting through the shutters, though no one dared approach close enough to confirm. Rumors spread among the children that the mannequins were not mannequins at all, but villagers taken and stuffed, their skins stretched over frames. Mothers hushed them, fathers cursed them for speaking evil, yet the stories persisted. And always, when fear grew too sharp, the physician appeared in daylight with his gloved hands and calm voice, soothing away suspicion with a kindness too polished to be doubted. The truth was that the cellar had become more than performance to him. It was experiment, ritual, obsession, all joined together. He began timing the deaths to the tolling of the church bell, aligning human screams with the rhythm of sacred time. He wrote that the villagers unknowingly played part in his work, their prayers upstairs balanced against his theater below. He believed he was building a mirror of heaven and hell inside the Barrow House, a stage where mortality itself performed for him. And yet, there was no audience outside himself. The mannequins stared blankly, the jars whispered faintly, the cellar walls held the echoes. His work was unseen, unpraised, unrecognized. This did not deter him. Instead, it fueled his certainty. He told himself that true genius was always hidden, that only centuries later would the world understand. His performances were not for applause of the living, but for eternity. The theater of silence grew fuller with each disappearance. Each victim became another actor, another note, another pause in his endless composition. The mannequins multiplied, the jars filled, and the cellar itself seemed to vibrate with layered echoes of agony and silence. Outside, the villagers clung to routine, blind to the truth. They did not realize that every time a voice vanished from their midst, it had not been lost to wolves or roads, but had been cast in a play beneath their feet, a performance staged in darkness, applauded only by mannequins and jars. The physician continued his double life without falter. In daylight, he carried bread to the starving, whispered prayers to the dying, and stroked the heads of children. At night, he returned to his theater, bowing to mannequins, forcing screams into song, silencing voices like curtains falling. He was both savior and executioner, both healer and director, both loved and feared. And in the cellar, the performances continued, building towards something larger, something the village would not be able to ignore forever. The theater of silence was not the end of his imagination. It was only a stage for what would come next. The physician's obsession began to move away from voices and toward blood. He had long studied the works of men who mapped the pathways of veins, who charted the currents of life flowing through fragile bodies. But where others saw medicine, he saw a garden waiting to be cultivated. He believed the human circulatory system was a design too beautiful to be wasted in decay. It was a network of rivers that could be drawn out, arranged, displayed, a living sculpture hidden inside every person, waiting for his hands to bring it into the open. He began with animals, strays caught in the forest or stolen from fields. He drained their bodies slowly, replacing their veins with glass tubes. He watched with fascination as the blood moved through the transparent channels, glowing faintly in lantern light, pulsing one last time as the heart died. He called these experiments blossoms, the first sprouts in a garden that only he could tend. The jars of voices on his shelves became companions to these new creations, as though sound and blood were partners in the performance of life. But soon, animals were not enough. He needed human veins, human pressure, human flow. Victims chosen for this purpose were not strangled quickly or silenced with wires. They were prepared carefully, with patience that bordered on reverence. He strapped them upright in iron frames, their limbs extended like branches. He cut open their skin along the arms, the legs, the chest, following the paths of veins he had memorized from his books. Then he replaced each vessel with a glass channel, sealing it into the flesh with resin. The blood was not spilled but guided, made to travel through his design. When the heart still beat, the tubes filled, glowing like red rivers. The victims watched their own life move outside them, unable to scream through the gags he tied into place. He recorded their pulses, measured their decline, and admired the beauty of the glowing web as the heart slowed. To him, it was not death but blooming, a final flowering of the body before silence. He arranged the corpses like plants in his cellar. He placed some in corners, others in rows, all fixed in frames so their networks of veins shimmered like gardens of crimson glass. He lit lanterns beneath them to make them glow, bathing the cellar in shifting scarlet light. He called this his garden of veins, a sanctuary where he could walk at night, trailing his gloved fingers along the tubes, whispering to the silent blossoms. He wrote in his journals that the garden spoke to him, that the blood remembered, that each flower carried its own song even after death. To the villagers above, the physician continued to wear his mask of kindness. He carried bread, treated wounds, smiled with weary compassion. But they began to notice something unsettling. His gloves were always spotless, yet faint stains of red sometimes marked the cuffs of his coat. He explained these away as accidents of his work, small sacrifices for the health of the people. No one pressed further. They owed him too much. They needed his care too deeply to question the marks that should have raised alarm. The fear of the Barrow House grew, though no one admitted it openly. Some swore they saw light glowing from beneath the shutters, not firelight, but a steady red pulse, as if the house itself were breathing with veins of its own. Others claimed that on misty nights, the air smelled of copper, the sharp tang of blood carried across the fields. Children whispered that the ground around the house was warm, that worms rose to the surface as if the soil itself was fed from below. Still, no one dared confront him. Their silence was his shield. Inside his garden, the physician grew bolder. He began experimenting with mixtures, adding powders and salts to the blood to change its color. Some veins glowed faintly blue, others dark purple, others almost black. He arranged the bodies like a painter, setting contrasts between light and dark, building what he believed was a new form of art. The mannequins still sat in their rows, silent audience to this new exhibition. The jars of screams whispered faintly from the shelves, harmonizing with the glow of the veins. It was a cathedral of cruelty, each corner alive with his twisted devotion. But the garden was not only for beauty. It was for knowledge. He recorded the time it took for each vein to collapse, the order in which organs failed, the strength of the final pulses. He wrote that suffering was a teacher, that death revealed its lessons only to those willing to guide it slowly. He saw himself as gardener, priest, and scholar, all roles joined in one man. To him, the victims were not lost souls but blossoms granted purpose, their deaths rewritten as performances of beauty that only he could understand. And yet, the garden could not stay hidden forever. Lantern light escaped through cracks in the shutters. Strange red stains seeped into the soil near the well. The villagers felt unease tighten around them, though still they did not speak. Fear held their tongues, dependence bound their hands. And so the garden grew in silence, flourishing beneath their feet, nourished by their blindness. The Garden of Veins was not a final act but another step in the physician's descent. His cellar was no longer a single chamber. It was becoming a world of its own, theater, archive, garden, each section feeding the next, each cruelty layered upon the last. And as his garden bloomed in scarlet light, the village above carried on in ignorance, unaware that they lived above a sanctuary of blood, a harvest of veins cultivated by the hands of the man they trusted most. The physician's power did not rest only in his cellar. It reached upward, into the hearts and minds of the villagers, through the sacred words of faith. He understood that to maintain control, cruelty must not appear as cruelty at all. It must wear the mask of virtue. And so he became not only their healer but their preacher, a man who carried scripture in one hand and the promise of comfort in the other. His voice, calm and deliberate, spread through the village like smoke, filling every crack where doubt might hide. The church had no true priest in those years. War and plague had scattered clergy across the land, leaving small parishes to fend for themselves. Into this absence stepped the physician. At first, he only read psalms when families asked, standing beside coffins with his gloved hands folded. But soon, he began hosting gatherings on Sundays inside the Barrow House itself. The villagers, hungry for guidance, accepted the invitation. They filed into the lower hall, carrying candles, whispering prayers, never questioning why the man of medicine now spoke as man of God. His sermons were gentle on the surface, full of promises that suffering had meaning, that pain was not wasted, that every cry was heard in heaven. The villagers, weary from famine and loss, clung to these words. They did not realize he spoke of their pain not as a burden to be lifted but as a harvest to be collected. He twisted scripture to match his obsessions, describing voices as offerings, blood as holy rivers, silence as the truest form of worship. They nodded along, hearing comfort. But he was not offering comfort. He was training them to see agony as divine. Behind him, hidden from view, the cellar pulsed with its secrets. The mannequins sat arranged in their eternal audience. The jars of screams whispered faintly. The garden of veins glowed beneath lanterns, red light rising through the floorboards. Sometimes a faint hum escaped into the hall, blending with his sermons. He did not silence it. He let it breathe, convincing the villagers that the sounds were proof of God's presence. They believed the Barrow House was blessed, even as it reeked of death. He preached purity while his hands were stained with cruelty. He told mothers that their children's songs carried the power of angels. He told widows that their tears watered the gardens of paradise. He told fathers that sacrifice was the measure of faith. Each word was chosen, each pause deliberate, his voice slow and steady, as if he already knew the rhythm of their grief. The villagers left each gathering both comforted and unsettled, unsure why their chests felt heavier but grateful for his guidance. That unease was part of his design. Doubt, he knew, made them return, desperate for more reassurance, more words, more of him. The hypocrisy was absolute. On Sunday mornings, he stood above the cellar, speaking of salvation, his white gloves folded neatly. On Sunday nights, he descended below, turning those same hands to tighten wires, to guide veins into glass, to seal jars with the last notes of the dying. He was both shepherd and butcher, preacher and predator. Yet the villagers never questioned the contradiction. They wanted to believe in him more than they wanted to face the truth. Children were drawn most deeply to him. His sermons spoke to them in soft tones, urging them to sing louder, to trust their voices. He told parents that a child's song could bring blessings to the family, that encouraging music in the home would ward off misfortune. And so children sang more, their laughter ringing through the village, unaware that each note was a lure, each melody a thread tightening the physician's grip. Parents, proud of their children's voices, often brought them to the Barrow House for blessing. They did not know they were placing them directly into the predator's gaze. In time, his sermons grew darker, though the villagers hardly noticed the shift. He began speaking more often of sacrifice, of how beauty was born from suffering, of how silence itself was proof of holiness. He told them that when someone vanished, it was not a loss but a gift to God. The words unsettled some, but none dared to oppose him. To challenge him would mean standing against the only figure who seemed to offer meaning in their bleak lives. Silence, once again, became complicity. The Barrow House became both church and prison. Its walls absorbed hymns upstairs and screams below. The physician delighted in this duality. He believed he had united body and spirit, flesh and faith, pain and purity. His sermons were not lies to him. They were truths reshaped, the language of cruelty dressed in holy robes. He was convinced that his work was divine, that he had been chosen to reveal the secret harmony between agony and eternity. But whispers began to stir at the edges of the village. Travelers who attended his sermons left unsettled, claiming the prayers felt rehearsed, that the man's eyes gleamed too brightly when he spoke of sacrifice. Some villagers, too, noticed the way his voice grew stronger when speaking of suffering, as though he took pleasure in their grief. Yet fear silenced them. To speak against him would be to accuse not just a man but the very pillar of their fragile faith. The false sermons held the village in place, binding them with words sharper than chains. Each Sunday, they gathered in the Barrow House, believing they were hearing the voice of comfort. In truth, they were feeding the mask of a man who used scripture as shield and weapon. While their candles flickered in the hall, their dead sang below, their voices caught in jars, their veins glowing like gardens, their bodies arranged in silent theater. The villagers thought they prayed to God. In truth, they prayed to the physician. And the physician prayed only to himself. It was not meant to happen. The physician's rituals were designed to leave no trace, no proof, no witness who could speak against him. But one boy did not fully vanish. He was not chosen because he was weak or forgotten. He was chosen because of his voice. A choir boy, no more than 12, with a tone so clear it rang through the church like glass struck with silver. The villagers adored him, though they never imagined that his gift made him a target. To the physician, the boy's voice was not a blessing but raw material, a perfect specimen to add to his archive. The boy disappeared one gray afternoon, last seen walking with a basket of wood near the Barrow House. The village whispered wolves again, though their voices shook with disbelief. That night, the physician preached a sermon about purity, about how the voices of children carried directly to heaven. Mothers wept as he spoke. Fathers bowed their heads. None noticed how his gloved hands trembled slightly, not with guilt, but with excitement. In the cellar below, his new subject waited, strapped upright, throat prepared, lungs still strong. The physician had plans for him unlike any before. He wanted not only to preserve the boy's final cry but to orchestrate a song that would last beyond silence. He wired the throat carefully, adjusting tension until each scream rose into notes like a choir's hymn. He forced air through bellows, making the voice hold high tones until blood ran from the mouth. He recorded the sequence, sketching the patterns of vibration in notebooks with shaking hands. To him, it was perfect, the child's voice lifted to unnatural purity, tortured into divinity. But the boy resisted in a way the physician had not expected. Even as the wires tore at his flesh, he hummed fragments of hymns he had learned in church. He pressed the melodies between screams, weaving sacred songs through the suffering. It infuriated the physician, who wanted control, not defiance. He tightened the frames, cut deeper into the chords, forced the lungs to collapse. Still, the boy scratched the hymn against the wood of the chair, carving crude lines with his fingernails, marking each note as though trying to leave a map of sound behind. His body shook, his voice cracked, yet he kept humming. The performance ended in silence, as all did. The physician sealed the last scream into brine, another jar for his collection. But he did not notice the scratches on the chair, not at first. He stored the body in his garden of veins, arranged neatly among the others, and moved on. The cellar swallowed another victim. Above, the village carried on in ignorance, mourning quietly, whispering prayers, convinced the boy had been taken by fate. The physician preached again on Sunday, his voice calm, his gloves spotless, his smile soft. Years passed before the marks were found. When the Barrow House finally fell into ruin, when investigators entered its cellar after the physician had vanished, they discovered the scratched chair. At first, the markings were dismissed as the frantic clawing of a dying child. But a scholar recognized the pattern. The scratches were not random. They were notation, crude but precise, lines etched with desperation but shaped into melody. When played, the scratches revealed a hymn, fractured, halting, but unmistakably a song. It was the boy's voice, left behind in wood. The discovery horrified those who heard it. The hymn was broken, layered with pauses that mirrored gasps, the notes rising too high, then collapsing too low, as though the child had been forced into unnatural ranges. Listening felt like listening to a body suffer through melody. Yet the song carried defiance, a stubborn attempt to remain human within the machinery of cruelty. It was proof not only of what had been done but of resistance, of a voice that refused to vanish. The villagers who survived would not speak of it. The hymn was buried in silence, the scratched wood hidden away, too painful to display. But whispers of it escaped, spreading as legend. Some said the hymn was cursed, that playing it summoned cries in the night. Others said it was holy, the only surviving prayer from beneath the Barrow House. But all agreed it was a sound that should not exist, a song born of torment, left behind by a child who sang against death. The physician had sought to control every note, every cry, every silence. Yet in his obsession, he had allowed one fragment to escape him. The boy's scratched hymn became a ghost that outlived the man, a haunting reminder that cruelty, no matter how careful, cannot erase every trace. It lingered in wood, in memory, in whispered song, carried through the years by those who dared to remember. And though the jars of screams remained silent when found, though the mannequins stood motionless, though the garden of veins had rotted into black stains, the scratched hymn endured. It was the song that escaped, the proof that even in the darkest theater, even in the cruelest garden, even in the most false sermon, one voice had fought to remain. The Barrow House could not hide forever. For years it had stood at the edge of the village like a festering wound, whispering its secrets only to those who dared listen. But whispers have a way of reaching ears not meant to hear them. Rumors spread beyond the valley, of children vanishing, of strange lights, of music that floated through stone. When travelers told these stories in nearby towns, officials took notice. The age of silent superstition was fading, replaced by law that demanded answers. And so one winter morning, men in heavy coats rode into the village, carrying papers marked with seals of authority. The villagers watched in dread. They had prayed the Barrow House would remain untouched, its horrors sealed away by silence. To open it meant risking truths too heavy to bear. Yet none dared stop the officials as they approached the rotting gate. Snow fell thick, muffling every sound but the crunch of boots. The men carried lanterns, weapons, and the weight of the law, but even they hesitated before the door. The house seemed to lean toward them, as though it listened, as though it waited. When the lock was broken, the door groaned open not like wood but like lungs drawing a final breath. Inside, the air was thick with rot and something sharper, iron, salt, and decay. Dust clung to the walls, yet beneath it lay the order of a life meticulously lived. Books lined the shelves, jars of herbs still neatly labeled, gloves folded in drawers as though awaiting hands. At first glance, it was only the home of a scholar who had vanished. But the silence was too deep, the shadows too thick. The officials pressed forward, lantern light trembling as they descended the stairs to the cellar. What they found was not chaos but arrangement. Mannequins sat in rows, dressed in rotting finery, their glass eyes fixed on the center of the chamber. Their hands, positioned in applause, seemed to glow in the light. Between them stood the table, polished smooth, its surface stained in ways no washing could erase. Around the walls, shelves stretched high, lined with hundreds of jars filled with clear liquid. The men leaned close, expecting to see specimens of roots or flesh. Instead, they saw nothing, only faint bubbles, faint swirls. Yet when they held the jars to their ears, some swore they heard whispers, faint cries trapped in liquid silence. The jars were catalogued later, but none dared open them. Beyond the mannequins, deeper still, lay the garden of veins. The lantern light revealed glass tubes tangled like vines, arranged through corpses long since drained. The bodies stood upright in frames, their flesh withered, their veins replaced with brittle glass. Some still glimmered faintly, as though stained by what had once flowed through them. The officials recoiled, some vomiting, others crossing themselves. The cellar floor was dark with stains that had soaked so deeply they seemed to pulse in the light. The air itself vibrated faintly, as though the walls remembered every scream. In a side chamber they found notebooks stacked in perfect rows. Each page was filled with drawings, diagrams, and notes written in steady hand. There were no confessions, no apologies, only precision. Measurements of breath, diagrams of veins, calculations of pitch. Each book treated human suffering as data, each line written without hesitation. Some pages described performances, the length of silences, the timing of strangulations, the arrangement of mannequins in their seats. Others described mixtures for preserving sound, experiments with brine, attempts to distill agony into permanence. The handwriting never faltered. To the man who wrote them, this was not horror. It was discovery. But the man himself was gone. The officials searched every corner, pried open every boarded window, dug through the snow in the yard. They found no body, no trace of escape, no sign of struggle. It was as if he had dissolved into the house itself. Some whispered that he had fled into the forest, others that he had taken his own life and hidden the remains. But those who spent too long in the cellar believed something else, that he had vanished into his work, consumed by the echoes he had captured, becoming part of the house's song. The Barrow House was sealed, but it did not rest. The villagers begged the officials to burn it, to erase it from the earth, but law demanded preservation of evidence. Guards were posted, yet none lasted long. They complained of hearing applause at night, of feeling watched by the mannequins, of whispers rising from the jars. Some said the glass figures in the garden shifted in the dark, veins glowing faintly as though life still flowed. Within months, the guards abandoned their posts. The house stood empty again, holding its secrets in silence, waiting. The collapse of the Barrow House was not of wood or stone but of trust. The villagers never recovered. They stopped speaking of charity, of sermons, of healing hands. Every kindness became suspect, every touch measured with fear. Children were warned not only of wolves and rivers but of men who smiled too gently, who listened too closely. Faith itself fractured. The church remained empty, prayers offered only in private whispers. The village, once bound by community, dissolved into suspicion and silence. What the officials carried away were only fragments, the notebooks, the jars, the stained chair with its scratched hymn. The rest remained locked behind boarded windows. Yet the memories spread beyond the valley, carried in whispers and court documents. Scholars studied the notes with morbid fascination, doctors denounced them with outrage, priests called them blasphemy. But none could deny the precision, the method, the devotion written into every page. This was not madness scrawled in frenzy. It was cruelty sharpened into science. The Barrow House never truly collapsed. Its roof sagged, its walls crumbled, but its weight remained heavy in memory. Those who entered spoke of leaving changed, as though the air itself had lodged inside their lungs. They described a silence that followed them, a silence heavy with the echo of voices that should not exist. The cellar could be locked, the windows barred, but the sound, faint, persistent, lingered in the minds of all who had heard it. The collapse was not an ending. It was the beginning of the house's legend. The collapse of the Barrow House did not end with its discovery. It spread outward like a sickness, infecting courts, churches, and parliaments. The officials who entered the cellar never forgot what they saw, and when they returned to their cities they carried more than notebooks and jars. They carried nightmares, images that refused to loosen their grip, visions of glowing veins and silent mannequins that made sleep a torment. Some resigned from their posts. Others became determined to change the laws that had allowed such a thing to happen in silence. Inquests were opened. The physician's name was whispered in courtrooms, though never loudly, for the details of his acts were too grotesque to place into official records without softening. Still, enough was written to stain history. Children had been taken. Beggars had vanished. Experiments had been performed with precision too deliberate to be dismissed as madness. The question was not whether the crimes had occurred, but how no one had spoken against him sooner. How had an entire village lived above a slaughterhouse and never raised their voices? The answers unsettled the powerful. Fear, dependency, the weight of respectability, these were not crimes of one man but flaws in the whole of society. If evil could hide behind clean gloves and gentle sermons, then what protection did laws truly offer? Politicians, horrified and shamed, began drafting new decrees. Records were to be kept of the dead and missing, with names written, graves marked, and disappearances investigated. Physicians, once trusted without question, were now required to register their work, their studies, their patients. No one could again be allowed to perform experiments in silence. Churches, too, bore scars from the discovery. Priests who read the physicians' twisted sermons saw how easily sacred words had been reshaped into weapons. Councils gathered to demand stricter oversight of who could lead congregations, and communities were warned against placing faith in a single man. The memory of the Barrow House became an unspoken warning that holiness could be mimicked, that kindness could be a mask. Some called for exorcisms, convinced that what had taken place in the cellar was not only human cruelty but demonic influence. Others insisted it was worse than demons, it was man alone, without restraint, without conscience. The jars, the notebooks, and the scratched hymn became evidence stored under lock and guard. Few were allowed to examine them. Those who did claim the jars sometimes rattled in their cabinets, as if something inside pressed against the glass. The hymn carved into it was played once in a chamber of scholars, and the melody made grown men weep, its fractured tones carrying both innocence and agony. The performance was never repeated. It was decided that such evidence was too dangerous, too haunting, to be exposed to the public. And so the items were sealed in archives, marked confidential, their contents whispered only in academic circles. Yet the legacy could not be sealed completely. The Barrow House lingered in the village like a scar. No family wanted to live near it, yet no one dared destroy it. To burn it felt like inviting its ghosts into the air. To demolish it felt like breaking open a tomb. So the house was left to rot, its shutters nailed shut, its garden overtaken by weeds. A memorial was eventually raised in the churchyard instead, a simple stone etched with no names, only the words, for those who were not allowed to rest. Villagers left flowers there in silence, never speaking of who the flowers were for. The wider world adopted changes that carried the shadow of the cellar. Laws on burial tightened, ensuring that no body could be taken without record. Orphans were counted, placed under supervision, no longer left as invisible prey. Physicians were watched more closely, their studies regulated, their methods questioned. In time, these reforms saved lives. Yet beneath the progress lingered a quiet truth: they had been born from horror, from a man whose white gloves concealed more than blood, from a community that chose silence until it was too late. Generations later, the story of the Barrow House faded into legend. Children in nearby towns told it as a ghost story, laughing nervously about mannequins that applauded in the night, about jars that sang when the moon was full. The real details, the scientific cruelty, the ritualistic performances, were lost in the retelling. But the shadow remained, haunting law and memory alike. Officials invoked it when debating ethics, priests mentioned it in warnings about false prophets, parents whispered it to keep children close. The physician's name was erased, but his legacy endured. It lived not in honor but in law, in memorials, in the quiet reforms that shaped society's conscience. The village carried its shame silently, knowing it had sheltered a monster in plain sight. The world beyond carried its fear, knowing that monsters do not always roar. Sometimes they whisper prayers, sometimes they heal wounds, sometimes they wear gloves so white that no one dares question what they hide. The Barrow House stood empty, its windows blind, its cellar sealed. But its memory was alive, buried not in soil but in statutes, sermons, and stones. A legacy written not by the victims, who never had a chance to speak, but by those who came too late, those who tried to make sense of silence after the song had already ended. When the Barrow House was finally locked and left to rot, it did not leave only fear behind. It left a deeper wound, one that could not be sealed with new laws or guarded archives. It left the memory of how ordinary it had seemed. That was the weight villagers carried to their graves, the fact that evil had not come roaring in the night, but had walked among them with a gentle smile and gloved hands. The most terrifying truth was not what had happened below the floorboards, but how invisible it had been above them. The physician never raised his voice, never threatened, never revealed even a shadow of what he built in his cellar. He was polite, careful, soft-spoken. He carried bread to the hungry, coins to the poor, medicine to the sick. He preached purity, he whispered comfort, he bent his head in prayer. He looked no different than any other man of mercy. And that, more than the screams and jars or the veins in glass, was what unsettled those who survived him. He did not seem like a monster. He seemed like a neighbor. The villagers replayed their memories endlessly. They remembered the way he had pressed a hand on a shoulder, how his gloves felt firm but kind. They remembered how he had smiled at their children, how his voice had steadied them when death took their kin. They remembered trusting him, depending on him, admiring him. And each memory became poison. For if they could not see what he was, how could they ever trust anyone again? If kindness could be so hollow, if comfort could be so false, then what shield did they have left? The officials who studied the case came to the same conclusion, though they wrote it in colder words. Evil had not entered the village by force. It had been invited in, seated at the table, honored with respect. It had worn the clothes of goodness so perfectly that no one dared doubt. This was not the madness of a wild beast. It was calculation, patience, method. It was the whisper of normalcy, the mask of the everyday. In the years that followed, stories spread of how the physician had blended into ordinary life. Scholars described him as a warning, priests as a false angel, parents as a ghost to frighten children. But behind all retellings was the same dread, that nothing about him had seemed extraordinary. He had been a man like any other. That thought lingered heavier than the horrors of the cellar. For while jars could be sealed and gardens of veins forgotten, the idea that anyone could wear such a mask could never be buried. Some villagers swore they heard echoes of him and others long after his disappearance. A neighbor's politeness suddenly felt rehearsed. A stranger's smile seemed too careful. Even acts of kindness were questioned. Suspicion became a permanent part of their lives, a defense against being fooled again. The physician was gone, but the fear he taught them, the fear of being unable to tell the difference between mercy and malice, remained forever. The Barrow House itself embodied this lesson. By daylight it looked like any ruin, a house no different than others abandoned by famine or plague. Its shutters were nailed, its chimney broken, its roof sagging. Yet all who passed knew what it had once contained. Its ordinary shape became a disguise, a mask of timber and stone. The house was the man, and the man was the house, both hiding horrors behind appearances of normalcy. When survivors spoke quietly, years later, they said the greatest cruelty was not the deaths themselves, but the betrayal of trust. To suffer by the hand of a monster is terrible, but to suffer by the hand of someone believed to be savior is unbearable. That betrayal hollowed out the very idea of safety, leaving only silence where trust had once lived. And so the whisper of normalcy became the final lesson of the Barrow House. Evil need not appear violent, need not rage or announce itself. It can be polite, patient, ordinary. It can stand at the altar and speak of purity. It can wear spotless gloves and smile as it heals a wound, all while preparing a chamber of death below the floor. The danger lies not only in cruelty, but in its disguise. This was the horror that endured after the house was sealed, after laws were passed, after memorials were raised. It was not the jars or the mannequins that haunted memory most, but the thought that the next man in white gloves might carry the same mask. That thought crept through every generation, a whisper that never faded, reminding the living that evil does not always look monstrous. Sometimes, it looks familiar. What if the Barrow House was not unique? What if it was not a cursed ruin, not an isolated wound in history, but only one mask that slipped long enough for the world to glimpse the face beneath? This is the question that has haunted every retelling, every courtroom, every whispered warning passed down after the cellar was discovered. For if evil could live so quietly in a small village, if it could thrive under the disguise of kindness for so many years, then where else has it hidden? Where might it be hiding now? The story did not end with the closing of the shutters or the sealing of the jars. The man was never found. His gloves, his coat, his journals, yes, those remained. But not his body. Not his final breath. He vanished into silence, leaving behind only the echoes of what he had done. Some believed he escaped to another village, that he began again under another name, repeating his work where fear and silence could once more shield him. Others believed he dissolved into the house itself, his spirit bound to the whispers in the walls, his presence felt in every hum that travelers swore they heard. Whatever the truth, the absence of an ending left the story unfinished, and unfinished stories do not die. The survivors carried their dread into the next generation. Parents warned their children not only of wolves and rivers but of men who smiled too warmly, of strangers who offered kindness without reason, of voices that seemed too careful. Trust itself became fragile. For how could they know that the man who bent to tie a child's shoe, or who prayed softly in church, was not another mask waiting to be lifted? The whisper of normalcy that had once lulled them now became a warning. The laws that were written, the memorial that was built, the sermons that were corrected, all of these were born from fear of repetition. The Barrow House was not remembered in detail, because the details were too heavy for ordinary memory. It was remembered in principle, as proof that cruelty thrives best when no one questions goodness. Officials used it to warn against blind trust. Priests used it to caution against false shepherds. Doctors were forced to work under watch, no longer allowed to heal without scrutiny. Yet none of these protections erased the possibility. They only admitted it existed. The horror of the Barrow House lies not in its grotesque spectacles, the jars, the veins, the mannequins, but in how little stood in its way. A man smiled, and people believed him. A man preached, and people followed him. A man gave bread, and people welcomed him. He built his cellar not beneath the house but beneath their faith, beneath their hunger, beneath their silence. The jars could be broken, the mannequins burned, the garden left to rot, but the conditions that allowed them to exist, those remained. And so the question lingers, growing heavier with time. What if it happens again? What if in another village, another city, another century, someone else wears gloves to hide their hands, someone else speaks softly of sacrifice, someone else builds a cellar beneath a house that looks perfectly ordinary? Would we see it sooner now, or would we once again let politeness, fear, and dependency keep us blind? The Barrow House teaches that evil does not thrive in chaos but in silence. It grows in the spaces where people choose not to look too closely, where suspicion feels impolite, where comfort is easier than confrontation. It thrives in trust unearned, in reverence unquestioned, in gratitude that blinds. It does not roar. It whispers. It does not demand. It offers. It does not force itself upon the world. It waits for the world to invite it in. The ruins of the Barrow House still stand, though the roof is caved and the shutters hang loose. Travelers who pass at night swear they hear faint music, the echo of voices long gone, the scratch of M carved into wood. They say the air around it vibrates faintly, as though the house itself breathes. Some dismiss it as superstition. Others listen too long and carry the sound with them, a sound that grows louder in silence. Whether the physician's spirit lingers or whether the house simply remembers, no one can say. But the fear it inspires is real. And so the story closes, not with certainty but with a question. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could another man build a mask so convincing, a cellar so hidden, a cruelty so patient? Could we recognize him in time, or would we, like the villagers, sit in silence, grateful for the bread in our hands, blind to the screams beneath our feet? The Barrow House was one story. But it is also every story where silence shields cruelty, where trust is twisted into cover, where kindness becomes a mask. It is a reminder that evil is not a shadow outside our doors but a presence that can sit at our tables, bow its head in prayer, and smile as it listens. The singing drew children in once. It may yet draw others. And the question it leaves us with is the one that matters most. If you heard it, faint, fragile, beautiful, would you know to turn away?